Hello and welcome to another video review. This is XCOM Enemy Unknown for PC, Xbox 360, PlayStation 3, Mac, and iOS. This review is coming to you courtesy of Mr. Jensen. He sent me this, so thank you. It is greatly appreciated. This is the reboot of the XCOM franchise by Firaxis Games and published by 2K in October of last year. And it's kind of interesting because when this game got announced, it was almost like it was in response to the massive backlash that 2K got for the announcement of what would later become the Bureau XCOM Declassified. And this came out and it was like, hey, we are staying true to the original games, it's a strategy and tactics game, and they kept saying things like they'd played the older games for hours and hours and hours on end, studied them endlessly, that sort of thing, in order to make sure that this one was up to snuff. So the real question there is it? Well, as far as the presentation goes, they did a pretty decent job across the board. Now, granted, it does look like your average console game as far as the graphics quality goes. Some of the textures are really low res, some of them not so much. The modeling's generally quite good. The animations look kind of clunky. They're rather exaggerated, and in a lot of cases there are a lot of animation glitches, which results in some really odd-looking animations. Like, they will shoot at things that are not actually there, they'll be moving in odd manners, all sorts of different things like that. It ends up looking kind of odd sometimes, but for the most part the animations work quite well. The environments are kind of cool. They're pretty well detailed for the most part. There are only a few of them, which is kind of surprising because the original game had pretty much randomly generated levels. Now this one can't really do that, obviously, but you do get tired of going through the same few maps over and over and over again. Now, the sound design is something that's kind of all over the place for me. On the one hand, the sound effects themselves are quite nice. For the most part, they've got really good sound effects, particularly on the weapon sounds, which generally sound quite beefy and powerful. The environmental sounds are usually pretty good, the ambient sounds are pretty good. But then you get to the voice acting, which is either average or awful. There's really no in-between with it. Now granted, there's not a lot of awful voice acting in this game, but when you have characters like Dr. Valen, who is supposed to be German, I think, and she doesn't sound German at all. She sounds like somebody putting on a really fake German accent. Can't pronounce any German words correctly. That kind of takes you out of things a bit. But for the most part, the voice acting's okay. It does its job, and that's about all it needs to do. And then you have the music, which is done by Michael McCann. You know him for the soundtrack to Deus Ex Human Revolution. And there's kind of a problem with that, because a lot of the music in this game actually sounds like it came from Deus Ex Human Revolution. So, it's almost like the music has a bit of an identity crisis. Now, that doesn't mean it's bad music, and it actually fits the game pretty well for the most part, but the music almost seems like it was recycled or something. It's kind of weird. But what really matter are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this is that you are the commander of XCOM, the Extraterrestrial Combat Unit, and it is your job, as deemed by the Council of Nations, which created the organization, to repel the alien invasion that's happening right now. That should be the entire story anyway. The problem being that Firaxis decided that, unlike the original XCOM, where the story was actually pretty subtle, and it was told mostly in research, and you would uncover more information about these aliens as you went through, Firaxis decided to throw in story missions, as well as a lot of cutscenes. And they like to interrupt your game quite a bit to have scientists and such babble on and on and on about what could this mean, even though it's painfully obvious. For instance, one of the situations when you first encounter berserkers is, that one's not carrying a weapon like the others. I wonder what he could be up to. Even though he has this rather large metal claw grafted into his armor. It's like, gee, I wonder what he's for. Ugh. Seriously, Dr. Valen is one of the dumbest scientists I've ever seen in a game. It's just like, miss the obvious completely, go for things that actually, I don't know. Anyway, suffice to say, the story isn't this game's strong suit. In fact, it's rather annoying, and it drags out the game quite a bit. Which is weird, because a strategy game is supposed to be fairly long in this case. The original XCOM did take quite a while to play through, but it didn't burden you with story missions that have to be played in order to actually progress and unlock new research and such like that. Now, the new one, on the other hand, decided that, hey, we're going to lock off all the stuff like PSI operatives, for instance, until you've played a certain amount of story missions. Gee, thanks, game. Go from the organic approach that the original game had, where just over time you would encounter more and more powerful enemies, and it didn't really matter whether you were going on what would be seen as a story mission or not. In fact, there's only one story mission in the entire game, really. Now there's a bunch, and they interrupt your game quite a bit. Luckily, you don't have to go on most of them immediately, so that's a positive. But it is really annoying when you have to put up with these story missions all over the place, and then if you decided to enable the tutorial, then good luck, because you're in for at least an hour of tutorials. Yes, at least an hour of tutorials. It was a good 4 missions in before I finally got all the tutorial stuff out of the way. It was ridiculous. And so, of course, I restarted the game and said, screw that, no more tutorials, and it just jumped right into the game and let me actually play the game. It was much, much better than the tutorial. Anyway, what really matters here, though, is the gameplay, because that was what mattered in the original XCOM as well. Now, the original XCOM, like this one, had several elements to it. You had the base management, where you would manage, obviously, your finances in the base, as well as what your facilities were, your staffing, that sort of thing. You had the tactical combat, which literally was the tactics portion of the game. And you had your soldier management, as well as your missions and such. Soldier management can go into the base management. But the missions and stuff will be carried out on this screen called the Geoscape, which was also where you got access to all of your other stuff as well. You would start on the Geoscape, and that would be the real-time portion of the game, where you're basically waiting for things to happen, waiting for UFOs to show up, waiting for missions to present themselves, that sort of thing. And you would be presented at the beginning of the game with the place your base anywhere on the planet thing. And you could literally place your base anywhere you wanted it to be. Generally, it was a good idea to place it in some place like Europe or the US or something like that, because then you would have a very good central location to be able to go all over the place. With Enemy Unknown, they decided to change this up quite a bit. Instead of being able to choose your base anywhere you want it to be, you have to choose a continent to put it on, and the location within that continent is predetermined. So, you get different bonuses for actually choosing a given continent. For instance, if you choose South America, you get the bonus We Have Ways, which actually makes your interrogations and your autopsies go immediately, as opposed to having to take several days to actually do. Or you can do the European continent, which gives you the bonus to reduced upkeep on your workshops and your laboratories. And each of these has their own bonuses, obviously, their own trade-offs, and you basically have to choose what works best for you. Now, what I've noticed, though, is that the most useful one is Europe, because the upkeep stuff. At any rate, when you actually get into the base management, you will find that while in theory a lot of the stuff from the original game is intact, they did change up a lot. For one, you get one base. Period. End of story. You have one base. In the original game, you could build basically as many as you could support. And each of them could have their own away teams, where you could send your guys on missions, and if they were closer on their base location, then it would probably be a good idea to actually send those guys to it, as opposed to the guys in, say, your main base, which, for instance, if you got a base in Canada, and you also got a base in, I don't know, Antarctica, and the guys in the Antarctica base are closer to a given event, it's better to send them out than the guys from Canada. Makes sense, right? Well, in this one, you get one team and one base. So that one team is doing literally everything in the game. Creates a very different dynamic to play. Because now you can't really do all that much. You get access to one mission at a time, which is rather annoying, actually. Because unlike in the original game, where you would have multiple things happening at once and you had to deal with it, and it could get overwhelming, but that was kind of the point. In this one, you get a choice between 3 missions when it's doing alien abductions, and these are in 3 different locations, and you just have to pick which one is going to panic the least. It rather dumbs down the whole experience of sending out your units and everything, so it's not really a good trade-off. Yes, it's simpler, but it really reduces the strategy elements in the game. And it really doesn't help that the base management has been cut down quite a bit as well. The base management itself consists of research, workshop, and facilities, as well as obviously finances, but I'll get to that in a moment. In the case of the facilities, you have given tiles that you can actually build facilities on, and these are things like laboratories or workshops or power generators, all sorts of different things. And so you have to actually excavate into the earth in order to actually be able to produce new facilities, and the further you go into the earth, of course, the more it's going to cost and the higher your upkeep's going to be. Now, certain buildings require certain tiles, like the thermogenerator requires tiles that have steam, which admittedly a thermogenerator is much better than a normal power generator, but it's more limited, obviously. So you kind of have to balance that sort of thing out. But other than that, there's really no strategy to building facilities in a certain way. If you build facilities next to a power plant, then they get more power than ones that are further away, but that's kind of it. There's no base invasions in this game, which is really weird. The original game, the aliens could actually find your base and invade it, and that was a very, very tense experience, because it's like, oh crap, they found us, and you had to be really careful about that sort of thing. In this one, you can just do everything willy-nilly and nothing really happens, and obviously building up your facilities doesn't really affect that in any way. You will never have to defend your base, basically. And so that reduces some of the strategy from the base building, but it's not that big of a deal. It's just, it removes one of those elements that really did create a lot of tension in the original game. So, the facilities themselves also actually require certain materials. Maybe they'll require a certain amount of alloys or Illyrium or something like that. But they also require engineers to build in some cases. And if you don't have enough engineers, you can't build it. So that leads me into the workshop itself, which is a lot like the original game, except that for most items now, they have immediate production. So, say you want to build a few laser rifles. In the original game, you would assign your engineers to it, and you would produce however many laser rifles you wanted, and it would cost you a certain amount of credits. And it would take several days to actually produce those rifles. In this one, the rifles require alien alloys, as well as money, and they require a certain number of engineers. And if you don't have any of that, then you can't build them. But if you can build them, you build them instantly. So you can just immediately equip your team with them, as opposed to waiting several days in order to actually get them. It's a bit of a trade-off, but I don't like the way it's done, because it requires a certain number of engineers to actually build anything. Now, there are a few items that you start out with the capability of building, or really early on can build, and they don't require engineers. But there's stuff like medkits, and the arc thrower, which is basically the stun prod from the original game, only it's just it's basically a taser. And you can also build things like satellites, but those also require a certain number of engineers. And those are one of the only things that actually takes several days to build. In fact, I believe it takes about 20 days to build them. So that can get kind of annoying, and I'll get to that in a moment. The next bit is the research bit, where you assign your science team to research a certain topic, whether it be, like, say, an alien autopsy, or any sort of technology, like propulsion systems, or armor, or weapons, all sorts of different things like that. And you assign them the project, and then it takes a certain amount of time to get done, and it's several days. The more scientists you have, the faster the things get researched. And unlike the original game, where you could have multiple scientists working on multiple projects, you can only have one research project at a time. Which isn't really that big of a problem, because the research usually goes fairly quickly, and there's really not all that many research projects in the game. And those that are, you can kind of muddle around. I'll get to that in a moment. But having mentioned both of these things, I now have to mention the biggest bugbear with them. And that is, you cannot hire scientists or engineers. You have to wait for the game to give them to you. Whether that be as a reward for a mission, or just at the end of the month you'll get an additional certain number of engineers and scientists because of the various member states to XCOM, that project I mean. If you have a satellite over their country, then some of them will be able to give you engineers and scientists, and that will just happen at the end of the month, whenever they give you the council report, which also gives you money. You can't hire, I should say, scientists or engineers anymore. Which means, if you don't have enough engineers, you can't build the things you need to build. Which becomes a really big problem. You're basically relying on chance. And that's kind of it. It's rather annoying. And, in fact, in pretty much every playthrough I did, I had a massive number of scientists, because the game was just giving them to me left, right, and center, but it wasn't giving me any engineers. And so I had problems with production. At one point, my guys were going up against cyber discs with friggin' conventional weapons. You know, just assault rifles, machine guns, body armor that you start with. Because I didn't have enough engineers to produce any of the stuff I'd researched, which was stuff like lasers and even friggin' Titan armor. I couldn't produce any of that because I didn't have enough engineers. And yet, my tech level was really friggin' high. I just couldn't produce anything because the game's like, screw you, you're not getting any engineers. Thanks, game. Thanks a lot. So that reduces quite a bit of the strategy in this game, and the management in the base itself ends up being rather pathetic as a result. Compound that with the way that the council situation is, where each member state of the XCOM project has a panic meter, and if that panic meter hits the maximum, then they run the risk of actually withdrawing from the project at the end of the month. And so, the way you deal with that is to complete missions within their given space, or to launch satellites for them, which also gives you more money per month. And it also, it'll give you different bonuses depending on where you launch the satellite as well. And so, obviously, you're going to want to launch a lot of satellites. Problems being, 1, satellites are expensive. 2, they take a really long time to build. 3, you need satellite uplinks or satellite nexi to be able to actually launch them. And a satellite uplink only allows you to launch 2 satellites, whereas a satellite nexus, I believe, is 4. And so, when you want to build satellite nexi, the problem being you don't have enough engineers to build them. You see where this all kind of blends together? It creates a big problem, because you're going to be losing member states because you can't do anything to stop them from removing themselves from the project. You can't go and deal with it. It's not like the original game, where you could go and have your guys shoot down enemy UFOs in the given space, and that would actually count. In this one, good luck actually shooting down UFOs until you get new fighter craft and their various weaponry, because pretty early on in the game, it's going to start throwing heavier UFOs at you, And those don't go down with the conventional weapons you're given. So, of course, you're going to need to have better equipment. The problem being that a lot of the weapons you get aren't really that great. So, intercepting UFOs becomes a problem, particularly considering the game doesn't really throw them at you very much. More often than not, you'll find yourself doing alien abductions, and that's kind of it, really. You'll also occasionally get missions from the Council to usually escort an NPC, but other than that, you're mostly going to be doing alien abduction missions. There are other missions available, but they're generally pretty similar to alien abductions. Now, they do have the terror mission system back from the original game, and basically the idea is you get dropped into a situation where there's a ton of aliens on the map, and they're running around blasting all the civvies, and you have to save the civvies. And so, whenever you go send your guys up to a civvy, then they'll, of course, run back to your ship, and they'll be saved. Whereas, the problem being, you don't know where all the civvies are, and the aliens like to just blast the living crap out of them, so, of course, you're going to run into problems with that. It gets kind of annoying, particularly in the late game, when the aliens never miss. Well, they never miss the civvies anyway, but you get the idea. So, that kind of leads me into the combat in this game, because there really aren't that many missions that you're going to be going on. Alien abductions, the big missions, the story missions, including those, and the escort missions, are generally all going to be on kind of the same maps. And they also have missions where you can go and deal with landed or crashed UFOs, and those are pretty much the same kind of thing too. So, you're going to get really sick of having the same maps over, and over, and over, and over again. It gets really predictable really quickly. Mission variety is surprisingly lacking in this game. Now, the original game was cut some slack because it had a lot of random generation in it, whereas this one doesn't. And you can understand why it doesn't, because it's running on Unreal Engine 3, but at the same time, it does make the battles themselves actually end up being rather samey. So, what about the tactical system? This also leads me into talking about soldier management. You can rename your soldiers. That was something they brought back from the original game. They brought back inventory management to some degree, where you can give your guys a primary weapon, a secondary weapon, which is always a pistol, the various types of armor, and an inventory slot. And that inventory slot is where stuff like grenades, or medkits, or the arc thrower, stuff like that go. And certain classes get access to actually 2 inventory slots, but it's one of the things they unlock. This game does, in fact, have a class system. There are 4 classes in the game: Assault, Sniper, Support, and Heavy. Heavies get machine guns. Support can use assault rifles, which is basically what everybody can use. The snipers get access to sniper rifles and various abilities for them. And the assault class actually uses shotguns. And each of them have their own set of abilities, which will unlock over the course of play as they rank up. And whenever they rank up, generally you get a selection of one of 2 abilities, and these each have their own ups and downs. Some of them more useful than others. In fact, in a lot of cases, I've found myself just going through the same exact thing over and over and over again, regardless of what the class was. Is that they would have just certain abilities within the classes you just go for all the time because it's just the best option. And so there was a lot of sameness with my soldiers in this game. It got really tiresome, actually. Now, there are some abilities that are more for specialization, like the heavies get an ability that gives them a great increase in damage against robotic enemies. The problem being there aren't that many robotic enemies in the game. So, obviously, you're not going to go for that unless you go for maybe one of your heavies. You'll go for that. And then they'll be the specialist against the robots, but you're not really sure when you're going to actually be fighting robotic enemies So you're probably not taking them with you. And so there's this really odd situation as to how they've done the class system. Even worse, it's done completely at random. It doesn't matter what your character's skills are. For instance, I've had guys who couldn't hit a damn thing become snipers, and I've had guys who hit every single shot from across the map, like through windows and everything, become assaults, which is the guys with shotguns. It doesn't make sense. Even worse is when the game just does it arbitrarily and doesn't give you a full squad. Now, that happens more often than not. In fact, I went through one playthrough and gave up on that playthrough very quickly because of just how ridiculous it was. But that particular game, the game gave me all heavies. Literally, my squad was nothing but heavies, which was useless. Now, you can have up to a maximum of 6 soldiers in your squad, with the game starting at 4. And there are reasons they did this and reasons that they shouldn't have done it. The reason they did it was because in the original game, you could have a squad of, I believe, up to 16 or 14 soldiers at a given time. However many could fit in the Sky Ranger, basically. And you could send your rookies out on scouting missions, and they basically become the cannon fodder, and that was one of the strategies that you could use. You didn't have to use it, but it was one of the strategies that developed out of the game. In this one, because they have limited the amount of soldiers you get in a given squad, it makes each soldier way more valuable. So losing them becomes a very large problem if you're kind of crap at the game. Which leads me into the actual tactical system. Now, the original XCOM had an action point system with regards to your soldiers. You would have your guys running around, and they would have a set number of action points that they could use per turn. You would use these action points to give them reaction fire. You would also use those points to get them into cover, get them crouched so they're harder to hit, that sort of thing. In this one, they have completely done away with the action point system, and you get 2 actions per turn with each character. Attacking uses up both actions if you do it without moving. You can move and attack. You can do a full move action, which would be considered dashing. Some classes get certain abilities with this sort of thing, like the Heavy gets an ability where shooting doesn't actually use up both actions, and so you can go for that for a more mobile Heavy class. And you also get abilities with the Assault class where you can actually do a dashing action and use a weapon at the end of the turn. And that can be for both Overwatch, which is basically the reaction fire in this game, or you can use it to attack enemies. And so, when you actually play the game, you effectively get 3 actions on certain classes, but for everyone else it's 2. And they also put in a cover system. Now, in the original game, cover existed, but it was more, it's the environment, you just have to use the environment to your advantage kind of thing. There wasn't a literal cover system. Aliens would shoot at you, and they would hit walls, and the walls would just crumble to nothing, and stuff like that, but that was the cover system. And it actually worked really, really well in the original XCOM. You would really catch on to how you could use the environment to your advantage, and it made the tactics have more depth, even though there is an element of random chance with the whole accuracy system in that game. In Enemy Unknown, however, they have a full-on cover system. You get light cover and heavy cover. Heavy cover being a full shield and the light cover being half a shield. And obviously the full cover is supposed to be better. And you get your guys into cover, and you basically just hope that the aliens don't hit them, even through the cover. Now, this presents a problem, because cover basically means nothing in this game. At all. All it does is make it slightly harder for the aliens to hit you. That's pretty much it. They're still probably going to hit you, because the AI in this game is complete BS. Now, You would think that getting your guys into cover and using their abilities to your advantage would make this game have some tactical depth. It actually doesn't. Because more often than not, it's more economical to just run your guys in, guns blazing, and they will actually do just fine. Even worse is when they spawn you on maps where there's barely any cover at all. And so, what cover you do get is pretty much useless. Good luck fighting those Muton Berserkers in cover. They run up and do melee on you. And there's some enemies that throw grenades at you as well, and that's much like the original game. But those actually don't show up until later on, which is kind of weird, because they would do that in the original game really quickly, and you would find that your team would get annihilated because grenades were thrown. But anyway, in this one, they've just done such a weird system. It's so bare bones, really, that it kind of eliminates any tactical depth, particularly considering that, unlike the original game where you would select a type of shot, you would do snapshots, aim shots, auto fire, which is 3-round bursts, and you would select a location to actually shoot at, and then they would shoot at it, and if they hit it, then they hit it. If they didn't, then it would hit things around them, basically. Or maybe it would go across the map. Who knows? It depended on the game, really. But you could target things. In this one, you literally can only target units. Only. You can't target anything in the environment. So if you, like, say in the original game, where you would have certain elements of the environment that would be explosive, and you would be able to actually have your guys shoot at that if there were aliens nearby, and it would cause a chain reaction that would actually take out the aliens. You can't do that in this one. You just have to get lucky. Or you can throw a grenade in that general direction and hope that it destroys everything around you in time, because with a lot of the cover in this game, it is destructible. In fact, most of it is destructible, but some of the cover will actually explode, but it has such a small radius for the actual explosion that there's really no point unless there's something right next to it. And even then, it's going to take basically a turn to actually explode. And so the aliens have plenty of time to get out of the way of that. That's not even mentioning that whenever you spot the aliens in this game, unlike in the original, where they were just running around the map and you would just have to happen across them, in this one, when you spot the aliens, they get this sort of intro cutscene thing that breaks away from the game and doesn't let you do anything, and then you have to sit there and watch as they run into cover. They get a free movement every single time you spot them, which is incredibly stupid, I might add. Now, once they've had that free maneuver, it's done. They don't get another free maneuver, but it's still stupid. It's completely unfair, because more often than not, you've just had your guy dash into cover because there's barely any cover on the map or something like that, or maybe that was the only cover between here and wherever you're trying to get to. Oh, look, you spotted aliens. Now he's completely exposed. Thanks, game. Thanks a lot. And that's not to mention the ridiculousness of actually attacking the enemy at any point. More often than not, your guys are going to miss. This is on any difficulty setting. It doesn't matter what it is. On the higher difficulty settings, your guys have much lower chances of hitting. I've had it to where guys who were literally right next to an alien, they weren't snipers, by the way, but literally right next to an alien, and they had hit chances of less than 50%. Whereas on normal, they had a hit chance of 100% in the same location. It didn't make any sense. So higher difficulty settings are actually rather arbitrary. It just says, oh, that means that you can't hit the aliens, but they can hit you. And it's more likely that your guys will panic and just do all sorts of stupid things. And it's more likely that you'll run into guys who hit you right immediately and just annihilate you in one shot. That's all that the higher difficulty settings do. They don't actually make it harder, per se. They make it more BS-y. And that was something that I really remarked on throughout this entire game. I wasn't having fun In the original game, despite its problems, despite the random chance that happened, despite the fact that it was really friggin' difficult, I still had a ton of fun playing it. And whenever I would get frustrated, it was the kind of frustrated that wasn't the angry frustrated. It was I'm gonna do better, and I'm gonna just kick those aliens' asses. And that was the kind of frustrated you got in the original 3 XCOM games. In this one, you just get angry. Because it's not a matter of you being good at tactics or not. It's all up to chance. Whether it be the base management, whether it be the tactics, doesn't matter. This is not a strategy game. You can't really develop strategy in this game because so much of it is up to chance. And when I see people sitting there telling me that stuff like, oh, I'm just playing it wrong or something, I look at it and go, I have played XCOM for quite a while now, and I really enjoyed the original games. Yet, this one I can't figure out? Huh? Even though it's way simpler, and they've removed a lot of things, and they've dumbed it down considerably, I can't figure this out? Huh? It's just that I had hopes for this game. I really wanted to like it. I went into this thing thinking, oh, the demo's not a good representation of the full game, because the demo was way too easy. And I went into this thing and found out that there are two extremes in this game. Either it is way too easy, or it is nearly impossible. There is no in between. There is no sense of actually getting better at the game. There is no sense of progression. Yes, your guys get access to better gear. It doesn't really matter all that much. Because, again, there's so much left up to random chance. And the game likes to throw things at you later on that really make all of your upgrades and such useless. And so, when you find things like, by the point I would have all my guys equipped in power armor and heavy plasma in the original game, I was still using lasers in Enemy Unknown, that kind of got depressing. Because not enough engineers. At any rate, Enemy Unknown is a game with good intentions. You can tell that the developers actually cared about the XCOM license, but it was like they had no idea how to pull it off. Like they felt they couldn't pull it off and instead tried to make it accessible to everybody, ended up making a game that's not even a strategy game. It's really just a roll of the dice. Either you hit the alien or you don't. More often than not, you don't. Either you lose the nation or you don't. It's all up to chance. No matter what your strategy is, you are subject to the dice. And so, when I look at this thing, and I have to assess it as a strategy game because it's trying to be one, it is not a good strategy game at all. Is it a good role-playing game? No. I don't know what exactly they're going for with it. Again, it feels like a game with really good intentions, like the developers wanted to make a good XCOM game, but they just didn't have the ability. Now, I'm hoping that Firaxis actually takes this and actually expands upon it and makes it better, and removes the complete BS crap that's actually in the game, and brings it back to those XCOM levels of glory. Now, don't get me wrong, the original XCOM had its problems too, but it didn't feel like everything was up to chance. It didn't feel like it wasn't a strategy game. It was definitely a strategy game, and if you knew what you were doing, you could pull it off. In this one, it doesn't feel like a strategy game. It doesn't feel like you can actually get better at the game. It doesn't feel like you can actually develop a strategy to actually deal with the aliens. You just have to get lucky. And that's really what happened in this game. More often than not, I found myself just going, well, I bet if I try this again, it's going to be the exact same thing, only something might change as far as getting hit or not. I don't know. Didn't really matter what my tactics were. Just up to the dice. And that's why I give it a 1.5 out of 5. Thanks for watching.